My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson. If you are back, you're back for another episode, and we've reached the 200s. I think 2 episodes ago was episode 200, now we're 202. So we're kind of in uncharted territory, but with a familiar guest, Todd Kashdan, the man who kind of ignited a revolution for me with his book, the dark side of your, or the upside of your dark side. I remember reading that and then kind of going down this rabbit hole with a few other books that were similar. Susan David wrote, I think it was Emotional Agility. And then I kind of kept going down that. And eventually it led me to Stephen Hayes. And I'm reading or listening to The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. But it's really colored kind of my interests, and that's why one of the reasons why I reached back out to him. So if you guys haven't listened to that episode, I would scroll back in the archives, check out the episode with Todd. But also to make this slightly more special with his presence, we have Tom Newton, a really good friend of mine, a fellow podcaster. So guys, before we get into the episode itself, backgrounds, all the formal stuff, how are you guys doing today?
Oh, great. I'm super excited to get philosophical about bodybuilding.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me on. Really excited. Todd, it's great to meet you. Read a lot of your work and just appreciate all the work that you do in the field, and looking forward to the conversation.
And for people who maybe aren't quite as familiar, given that, philosophical weightlifting composes two different things. It composes philosophy, or this thoughtfulness, and then it composes weightlifting and kind of this like physical culture aspect, and that kind of merges to create this thoughtful approach to lifting and living, and that's just something I really appreciate and enjoy doing. So Todd's work, is largely centered around thinking about and understanding ways that we can more or less instill, meaning and purpose in our lives and live in a way that is directed towards things that we value and want to fill our lives with, that will allow us to reach certain goals that we've set. So to kind of set the scene a little bit for people who haven't or aren't familiar with you, Todd, maybe you can give a bit of a background and kind of explain why, philosophical weightlifting does fit your interests so well.
Yeah, no. Thanks for having me on again. So I started grad school in 1998, and that just happened to serendipitously be the year that Martin Seligman was president of the American Psychological Association, and decided that his agenda was going to be this thing called positive psychology. And I met him as a first-year grad student, as humble and impostery as anyone else would be, with one of the top 100 most eminent psychologists. And I walked up to him, Robert Sternberg, who is the master of creativity, and Banaji, who is the master of implicit bias. The three of them were talking at a conference, and I walked up to them and said, "Hey, listen, how do I connect with you three? I mean, you guys are icons." And Marty, at that moment, said, "What are you studying?" And I said I was studying how do people develop panic attacks. And he said, "Are you interested in how people experience anxiety, or are you interested in what happens if they didn't have the anxiety?" And that moment was really, I realized I switched my interest to focusing on what I called in 1998 the residual unsatisfied curiosity by having uncontrollable, unmanageable anxiety or panic. And I wrote this down on a piece of paper. And I said, this is going to be my line of work for the next 20 years. And that's pretty much what's happened is, if you have these approach avoidance conflicts, you see a interesting podcast, you see an attractive person wearing a Fugazi t-shirt, one of my favorite bands, and then you decide, do I approach and go say hello to them? and interfere with their world, or do I avoid because I don't want to be seen as a threat, especially in the gym as you're weightlifting? And that decision of choosing the avoidance route leads to this residual unsatisfied curiosity. And what happens if it calcifies over time, over a
Mm.
lifetime? And this has been, sort of the central piece of how I've been developing a well-being laboratory for the past 2 decades and studying a whole range of topics that hopefully we'll get into a few of them.
I mean, I don't know why, but I think this is ultimately what's created this unique interest for me. Is I listened to that segment, that what you just said, and I feel so excited and so interested and like so charged about the things that you're discussing, and the way that you talk about them. Like, to me, that these ideas are so just fascinating, and there's something about them that like ignites this like central interest. And I feel like that's been present for like almost a decade now, which is why the podcast has morphed into what it is. um, Kind of from your perspective, when you walked up to those kind of like uh, huge names in the field, people that have really done a lot of incredible work, respectively, for those subjects or those topics, how has your life changed kind of from that moment on, from the perspective of that shaped the questions you started asking, it shaped what you started researching and studying, and then it shaped the way you started to understand the questions and the answers a bit more?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's my extemporaneous brain is thinks of two different directions to go. Is what did I gain from that interaction? And then what exactly were the questions of interest to me?
Mm.
So let me take the former, because I think that's more important for people listening to this. Is I was fortunate enough, and a lot of people do. A lot of people have, it's pure luck. If you end up having a good, nurturing set of parents, especially, for boys and men that are listening, if you happen to have someone that was progressive, not politically, but mentally, as a dad who like basically was comfortable with you being upset and crying as a young kid when you lost a competition, wrestling, football, basketball, fencing, whatever it is. Or if you had a mom that was basically allowed you to teach you how to like express yourself, like your vulnerabilities, and with clarity and articulation, especially as you started to become attracted to whatever people you were attracted to, friendship wise and romantic wise. And if you've had a mentor that you could bounce around ideas of like, listen, I just didn't get this job and I thought I freaking nailed it, and they can deconstruct it for you. For me, that interaction, because I left the New York Stock Exchange Wall Street floor where I worked before I went to grad school. So this was really new for me, finance to psychology. And that conversation with these three icons was enough for me temperamentally to say, oh, I've got the backing of powerful people. And now I'm going to zig when everyone else zags, zag when everyone else zigs. And I'm going to go rogue in terms of asking really strange questions. And I do think that some people have a longer runway that they need in terms of to get to that point. For whatever reason, I needed a very small runway. Like, can I just feel like this world of intellectual thought is a place where I belong?
Mm.
Because kind of like you guys, like I don't look like an intellectual, and you guys don't look like intellectuals. Definitely,
Right.
Josh. I know you don't. And so we're often not taken seriously until we open our mouths after 30 minutes. People are like, oh, I thought you're going to be a meathead. And that's all I needed. And it was really great, because my whole career has been, if everyone gets too excited about one topic, I think to myself, human beings are infinitely complex.
Mm.
There's no way that mindfulness is the panacea for life's ills. And when people talk about, a loneliness epidemic, my first response is, like, what other psychological, social, and cultural issues are being ignored? And we are obsessing too much about this umbrella of loneliness. And my brain automatically goes rogue as there's critical mass on a particular topic.
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. built with the intention to move with you and work for you. We create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
I've had a really difficult time, and I understand science is the control of as many variables as possible to understand the impact of changing one particular variable or changing something and then measuring the impact of that on whatever the outcome the outcome is. And for me, the hard part for me to wrap my head around is the absolute complexity of everything and the number of variables that we can know, the number that we can't know, and how these like what feel like really tightly controlled studies. It's hard for me to feel convinced that they're that tightly controlled, especially in like a training setting where it's like you have two groups, one group trains to failure and one doesn't, and like here's the difference between failure training and non-failure training on muscle growth and strength. And it's like I guess, but I feel like there's so much more underneath kind of the parsing out of like these really superficial variables that it's hard to feel entirely convinced. And I guess kind of what you were getting at is like, here's this idea of mindfulness as a panacea. It's like, is it really that? Can it be that simple? Or this like loneliness epidemic, can it be that simple? Um, so how have you been able to navigate this space of trying to understand by reducing, although knowing kind of with that you can't reduce nearly enough?
Yeah, and I really like that you brought this back to weightlifting, right? Because a couple of very straightforward bumper stickers have popped up. So you want to do high intensity interval training. That's the jammy jam jam, right? That just popped
Right.
out. And then there was, we've just discovered, particularly for women athletes or women who work out, is it's all about muscle mass in terms of aging, not cardiovascular activity, if you want to focus
Right.
on that. And as you're saying, these are great starting points, but they're really minimalist starting, like too minimalist. And for me, I think of dating. So when you think about dating, and you can read John Gottman's work, you can listen to who I think is the greatest thinker right now, who's alive, Esther Perel on romantic relationships, and you think about who would be a potentially good partner if you don't hold the belief that there's a single person on the planet for you, is it's got to be like at least 37 dimensions in a matrix that you're considering. And then that's not sufficient, because then it's okay, which things have to be above a threshold of those 37 dimensions? I'm making up this number of these 37 dimensions. And there a compensatory profile where they're not above thresholds on the ones you typically focus on, but it's so unique that it actually overrides the typical algorithm that would work for you. And it's just so
Mm.
complicated to think about matching with another human being on humor and politics and, religiosity and spirituality and psychologically minded and jealousy and um, comfort level with emotionally intimate friendships outside the relationship and family, and just goes on and on for these 37 variables. And there is no study that comes close to capturing that. So one of the things that I've changed my mind out over the course of my 20 plus years as a psychological scientist is I used to ask for evidence-based approaches for the world. And now I've I've sort of like accepted this different phrase, scientifically informed approaches. And that is, you look at the science and you examine what works for this, whatever the sample was that works on average, and then you integrate that into the DNA of, by testing and experimenting for yourself, what works best for you, which nobody is the average. So if you look at 25 brain scans of someone that has schizophrenia who are given an intervention where they're given more psychological independence to do projects on their own. And you see, well, how does this affect the brain pre-treatment and post-intervention? The average brain scan is nobody in that group. It's just an amalgamation, and every study is like that. So something for the readers to take is read these scientific studies. Try to, if you can, if you see a cool article in the media, try to read the original source, and then think of how does this work with my unique personality, life history, and preferences. And whatever you come up with should not look like anybody else, because you're not like anybody else.
No, that's a really good point, and it almost kind of thinking this way in myself. The last time we spoke, I think it was a while ago, but uh, I actually ended up getting into a PhD program that I start in the fall, for coaching and teaching studies. So basically, it's a PhD in sports science, and I'm kind
Nice.
of thinking,
Congrats.
yeah. So, thank you, Todd. And I'm kind of thinking about ways, I can explore concepts kind of similar to what you've done, but uh, maybe fit it into weightlifting, because at West Virginia University we have a weightlifting club, competitive weightlifting team. A lot of the research that goes on is within the sport of Olympic weightlifting. Um, a lot of it's like athlete monitoring. So I mentioned that I'm the strength and conditioning coach at a high school. So we're going to try to integrate that into some of the research and look at athlete testing over time with them. For someone who's starting out on this intellectual journey of understanding how to do science and how to think about it, how to understand it, from all perspectives, from asking the right questions to analyzing the data to writing it up. What's your advice for people who, I assume most people who are listening are, more intellectually kind of bent. They probably have pursued graduate degrees at a master's level or doctoral level, or they're interested in doing that. So, what's your advice to people who are in that situation, kind of at the start of their journey, pursuing something that's more intellectual and more formal?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, congratulations. And on top of it, the research project that you just barely sketched out is so pronounced and so high impact potential that is far beyond the dissertation ideas I hear from most graduate students. So I'm impressed with how non risk averse you are already. So this is one of the beauties, I think, of uh, the recommendation of it is beautiful to take years off into the real world between undergrad and grad school, and there is no rush to become an adult where you're
Right.
focusing on grout and insurance payments. So I think this is why some of the best students end up being people that have blue collar work experiences, unusual work experiences, and have just met a bunch of strange characters over the course of their lifetime who are not college students. And they take that, and it basically has this
Right.
beautiful smoothie effect of mixing all of these supplements and fruits and berries and vegetables together, and you get something that no one's ever created before. So that alone is an important element, is make sure you have a diverse range of life experiences, and do not think it detracts from your intellectual world. It is the inputs that separates you from the pack, because if you go into the world of thinking and creating something meaningful for the world, you need to have sufficient inputs, and you don't want to be listening to what everyone else is listening to. You don't want to read what everyone else is reading. And it's really the conversations and the travel experiences that don't have to be international, and the life events that you've contemplated, positive and negative, over the course of your history, that together gives you some semblance of ideas that are unlike any other person. So excavating your life history, to me, is really important for coming up with good questions. I have notebooks everywhere. I have my daughter, who's 10 years old. I'll regularly in the middle of the car say, listen, I had an idea. Can you just grab the notebook, the yellow notebook that's sitting right underneath the dashboard? And she'll start transcribing for me. And we'll stop the car if it's too long and I have to do it myself. And I think you want to be the type of person that, as much as sleep hygiene is fundamental to life and well-being, is, are you willing to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning if
Mm,
you have a great idea? If not, you're not ready to enter the space. It
right.
is painful. It goes against all the, all of the research on sleep hygiene, and yet this is what it means to accept a life of the mind.
I love that.
Todd, that's awesome. I was kind of thinking as you were talking about that, tailoring these inputs, making them unique. A lot of the times we hear that to kind of gain entry into a field, you got to have this baseline of knowledge, and that
Yeah.
assumes I feel like there's this commonality of inputs, right? But then beyond that, you have to tailor these unique inputs to, so that you can put out something really unique and special. How do you think about that? Maybe if you're advising someone who's just starting out in their career, or just kind of starting out learning about what they're passionate about, um, how would you advise them to tailor those inputs while balancing that baseline level of knowledge?
I am Tom, I am so glad you're going here. Um, so yes, I come from a white collar family, but at the same time, I was raised by a single mom, and then she passed away, and I was raised by a grandmother who was single or was widowed herself. And so I have, like everyone else, a pretty unusual background that most people, their initial response is, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and I say, "Don't worry about it. It happened when I was a long time ago. It's me. That's it." Um, I strongly believe, and if this hits one person, honestly, this will be worth everything in our conversation. I strongly believe that it is your uniqueness, not your shared qualities, that's going to make you a valuable creative influence in whatever domain you're going to go into. And I don't think you have to read varieties of religious experiences. And I don't think you have to read Sigmund Freud's books. And I don't think you have to dive into Carl Jung like I did, when psychology was in the 90s, of there are these tomes you have to get into. If you're reading graphic comic books, you're reading the Max, if you're end up that you're obsessed with, David Foster Wallace, and you made it through Infinite Jest, guess what? That is one of the greatest books ever written about what it's like to have a substance abuse problem and what it's like to parent someone to the level of obsessiveness to turn them into an amazing athlete and burn out a child. No psychologist to me has captured what it's like for parental over identification in a child's athletic activity than Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And so if we had a visual right now of my, and maybe I'll do this for a third time when I pop on, of my bookcase, it will not look like I'm a psychologist, because I think fiction is incredible. And I think, there's a crazy show I just started on Hulu called Tell Me Lies, about an 8-year toxic relationship that go back and forth in time through this. And man, does that make you think about a whole bunch of questions about exploring of how do you do a risk assessment early in a romantic relationship for potential narcissism, grandiosity, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and all sorts of ideas. And it's not, there's a psychologist didn't create it. It's just someone that really thought hard about the nature and challenge of like sharing your life with another person. And so let this be a opening to just collect a wide range of inputs, go to the things that excite you, but make sure that you are doing deep dives into them and spending a sufficient time, seemingly nothingness, of figuring out, why is this interesting? Why am I gravitating towards this? What are the ways this makes me think differently about other people that are like me or not like me?
That
I think.
that sorry,
Go ahead, Josh.
I just want I mean, I can't contain myself. That was an incredible answer, and it resonated so much, in the sense of, I remember when I really hadn't established an identity when I was like a high school kid, and kind of my first time in college before I dropped out, or what I call receded from college. um I didn't really have an identity, so I was trying to assume other people's, and it was like, I want to be like this guy or like this guy because this is what other people would like. And then when I started getting into lifting, I started kind of crafting kind of this unique space, and then I started getting into reading and becoming a bit more intellectual with a lot of my time, in the sense of like reading, thinking, and writing. And a lot of the influences I have and have used in the past would make probably zero sense to anyone in the weightlifting world. For instance, I referenced getting Stephen Hayes on the podcast. I don't know if anyone in weightlifting, really, who's not a behavioral analyst or someone who's in the behavioral field would know Stephen Hayes' work. And I think that's what makes it really special and really unique. And for me, really interesting is how can we bring that to a group of people who haven't been exposed to it and talk about it and think about it. And a good practical example is when people go for a lift and they freeze, right, and they can't do it and they can't access their movement, and they're like, I just started getting really anxious and thinking about what if I missed it or what if I hurt myself. How do I get rid of those thoughts? And the question becomes, why get rid of them? Why not just like pursue the lift in the face of it? And that's kind of what I do. It's like, I'm not going to make this. That's like a thought that immediately happens before I grab the bar, but I grab it anyways and I execute. And to me, it's this evidence of like, that doesn't control my action. I can act in the face of it in a way that's directed towards this goal of performing at a higher level, or getting stronger, or becoming a better weightlifter. And I think your spiel about creating that uniqueness and individuality, for me, has is a large reason why I've had the opportunities I've had, is because I've been able to carve out this space that's separate and different from a lot of what other people do. So if you go in my living room, there are books everywhere, and there are books about strength and conditioning, books about weightlifting, books about understanding pain and exploring pain, books about philosophy, and just kind of like this kind of wide-reaching net of uh, ways of thinking about the world. So I just really wanted to emphasize that for people who are listening and have these unique interests. It's not that you have to shy away from them. It's how do you blend them,
Yeah.
into everything else.
Yeah, I mean, people have asked me this question before of like, how do you? I remember when I met Steve Hayes. The way I met him is that he sat in on a talk I was giving as a grad student, and he had this entourage with him, and he came up to me and said, like, you're not like other people. Like, I need to know how you come up with these questions. And he just like tapped me on the shoulder or squeezed my shoulder, and then he walked away, and that was the start of our friendship and collaborations. And in some ways, the quickest way to being creative, which is the way I do, which is what I do. And basically, Josh, you're saying the same thing. It's combinatorial. And that is, once you start adding in all of the new unique things that you do and read, you very quickly become a smaller and smaller slice of the population that you relate to. So, I have Supple Leopard sitting on my shelf, and I'm sure both of you do. And you read that, and then you read David Foster Wallace, and then you read, right now, the book I'm reading is Chain Gang All Stars and Black Friday, which is basically like this, as opposed to a tome about what's wrong with the criminal justice system. It's a fictional novel about how perhaps in the future we will have people basically get to win a reduction or removal of their prison sentence by entering into a gladiator war. And in this fictional story, which is so beautiful, and I'm not going to ruin it for anybody, that all the footnotes give you the statistics of what's wrong with the criminal justice system. And I thought to myself, oh my God, what a great way, as opposed to proselytizing about what's wrong with the criminal justice system, create a fictional story where you enter in and are like, it's almost like an MMA fight. You're super excited about this gladiatorial fights. And then the footnotes say, yeah, you're experiencing what people who are sadistic experience, who are hired into jails and prisons, and it pulls you back in and it pulls you out with the footnotes. And I mean, this should get a MacArthur Genius Grant Award. And I didn't expect that at all for reading that book. And all of a sudden, it just makes me think. I'm like, wow, this is how you influence people. Really beautiful, creative art that's violent and sexual and deviant, and yet here you're teaching everyone about what's wrong with the criminal justice system, and they don't even know it at the same time. Like, what a beautiful strat. And so right now I am actually thinking about, okay, for the next book, is there a way I can hide the agenda so you'll enjoy it and you don't even realize you're learning? And this is combinatorial. Is you take all these little pieces, and after about 4 combinations, 4 talents that you have that you stack together, you're good with the bow and arrow, you're great at wooing people on first interactions, you are exceptional at deadlifting, and then you have great side to side, like physical agility when you play pickleball, and you can hold your whiskey like no one else. All of a sudden, you become like there's like 3% of the planet that's remotely like you, and the combinatorial approach to creativity is the quickest, most efficient way to doing something different and impactful.
So we've kind of explored the individual, the uniqueness, creating creativity, basically, or what the formula is for allowing for the development of creativity, coming around to more overarching ideas and concepts that you put definitions on and then try to move towards, and kind of what the title of this link is meaning and purpose. Where I first encountered this was one of the papers you did, where I think it was first formally defined for me, that I kind of I've read. You defined meaning and purpose, and I think Tom's podcast is centered around kind of the same ideas, and I'm sure at some point he'll email you asking for you to come on his show as well. But what, I guess, how would you define purpose and meaning, and then we can kind of explore like how you would work towards creating more of it in your life, or having more of it in your life.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Did we have this conversation that this is the exact, I'm doing the 10-year follow-up paper right now, and I just got the revised resubmit on my birthday. I'm actually going to be posting it on my Substack, an early version of it next week. Did we have this conversation?
We did not.
Okay, this is really interesting because I thought a great deal about what you just said ahead of time. This is like precogs in a Philip Dick novel. So I have revised, and I decided, let me create from 50 years of research on purpose in life. No one really has. If you read any book, I mean, everyone talks about Viktor Frankl, and from him, there's been Bill Damon and Anthony Burrow and Vic Straker and all these great researchers on purpose in life, and no one has really put down a really good definition. And so I have been spending the past 3 weeks creating a one-pager of exactly defining this for the field. Like, the way for a field really to progress, which is what Steve Hayes did with, you were just, Josh, you were describing cognitive diffusion without using the term, in having the thoughts of, and the aftermath of not being able to do a lift that you typically can do. And when you get this terminology, the language dictates consciousness. Once you get the terms down and the definitions, it's not because you need a definition, it's because once the definition exists, all of a sudden you start to see it more often, and it alters your attentional filter as you listen to people and walk through the world. And so with that backdrop, the way that we define purpose in life, and it's really a synthesis of the field. Again, it's just, I don't do anything new. I just synthesize ideas from other people. Is purpose in life, which is different than meaning in life, is what we call a central self-organizing life aim. So there's 3 elements in the definition. Central, in that if present and strong in your life, is for me to understand Josh, for me to understand Tom. If I did not know your purpose in life, you would say that we have not formed a highly intimate relationship, friendship, because of that. Like, I don't understand what that is. It is the bullseye, like the red dot in the middle of, in archery that happens there. This is the core part of your identity. That's one feature. The second feature, self-organizing, is that when present, this thing called purpose in life, it starts to influence the decisions that you make, because everything's a trade-off. And so you wake up in the morning, you have a finite amount of energy, time, attention, and money. And the decisions about how to spend it, there's always a counterfactual of what you could have been doing with it. And so if your purpose in life is to be as physically healthy and strong as possible, well, all of a sudden these decisions start to appear in terms of, Do I decide to have scrambled eggs and bacon for breakfast? Do I go out with my friends and have a what's that like cocktail that people have during breakfast?
Mimosa.
Mimosa, thank you. I don't drink that much anymore. Do I decide to make like my personalized smoothie where with ingredients that I know that my enzymes can break them down easily because I've been interested in functional nutrition because this is part of my purpose in life. You start what you read, what you focus on, what you eat, what you consume conversations, consume television, consume movie. It's influenced by this purpose in life. And that's the self-organizing element. And the third part is a life aim. So you might, if you go back to the purpose in life example that I just gave in terms of being as healthy and strong as possible, that is not something that you can finish in a short period of time. It's actually hard to find a terminal endpoint other than death. It's just something that you work on. And at a lower level might be concrete goals that are linked with that purpose, such as I'm going to hire a personal trainer to learn how to actually, do squats more effectively. I'm going to hire an agility coach so I actually can have like better lateral movements or work on my asymmetries in terms of the strength in my left and right knee that happens there. That's not your purpose. But if you have this higher order aspiration, purpose, they fall in there. So central self-organizing life aim is a nice thing that actually we were surprised that we were kind of the first ones to kind of really try to nail this butterfly to the board.
How did you come to that definition? I imagine there were a lot of competing thoughts about what the definition should be. How did you kind of back into that?
Well, yeah, no, it's intuitive, Tom, what you're saying. So there's been some pushback. So there's a team at Stanford University. We are not Stanford. We're just a public university on the East Coast. Doesn't mean we can't fight with the big boys. And they basically said, hey, you're missing a fundamental definition element, which is it should be about an activity that transcends the self. And we are putting in this new paper a retort to that to say, why is it not in the definition? And one of the reasons we believe is that is unnaturally limiting. We believe as opposed to your purpose, so that purpose I just gave you would not count because it doesn't transcend the self. It's about optimizing your health and fitness, right? So that wouldn't count. And we would say, well, that seems like an elitist mentality. So our hypothesis that we generate is that if your purpose transcends the self, it's about trying to improve the criminal justice system. It's about taking care of the next generation, especially those who live in impoverished environments. Again, that could be a central self-organizing life aim. It's not something you can finish quickly. If it transcends itself, we believe you get more downstream psychological, social, and physical benefits. So it's a moderator that changes the influence and the benefits of purpose, but it's not purpose itself. And I think it's a big elitist disservice to say your purpose in life doesn't count because you're focusing on being the most creative person possible or trying to be the most the least self-absorbed and narcissistic version of yourself, or to really maximize your intellectual potential. Like why should those not count just because they are about having mastering and optimizing the self with the one life you have on this earth?
Yeah, for sure. When you think about looking at your purpose, and if I'm a listener and I'm thinking about, hey, I'm kind of aimless, I don't feel like I have a great direction in life, how would you advise someone to go about finding that?
Yeah, that's a big question. So that is either my next book or two books from now. So I can't go. We can go into a little bit. I mean, I think one of the important things is to start doing more deconstruction. So why are you attracted to particular types of friends? The ones that actually you feel nourished as opposed to depleted when you're with. So
Right.
deconstruct the elements of those relationships. And the advice that I've been giving for 20 years, although I don't know if it's outdated with the focus on online content, is I always said is think about the books that you read that nobody else knows you're reading. Like, why are you gravitating towards them? Like, what is it about those topics that goes in there? And this is how I left finance to go into psychology, was I was stoned off my rocker in a golf course at 3 o'clock in the morning and with a bunch of friends. And I normally did not smoke at that time. So I get pretty paranoid. And while they were playing the harmonica, freaking me out, so I was underneath a blanket on the golf course, my friends asked me of like, hey, like if you're reading these books in your free time about the psychology of intelligence and the handbook of love and attachment, like why don't you just go into psychology and then just invest your money when you come home? And you're very susceptible when you are stoned at 3 o'clock in the morning to be like, yeah, I'm gonna flip my worlds around. And that's kind of what I did. But it was really about they were helping me deconstruct of you read all these like books about like you don't read finance books, you don't listen to CNBC. You're not whatever those finance shows are. Like you read about psychology. And this is a way I think of how you find your purpose in life. It's like, what do you naturally gravitate towards you because it's invigorating, it's interesting, and most importantly, is you're not doing it for likability. And that's where don't look at your social media feed to find your purpose in life. Look at what you don't post because you don't care whether people know about it or not.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, and kind of what we mentioned or what I mentioned off air is that I was finishing up a book from John Gottman on the science of trust, and I think Tom knows I listened to that, and I think maybe a couple other people, but like I really never mentioned it unless I was referencing it as, hey, here are some ideas or things I found really interesting about relationships and what can make them more or less like quote unquote successful. So I think that's really cool because I have like those different streams of interest, and generally that stream doesn't get as much play on social media because my presence is I'm kind of the weightlifting, powerlifting guy. Stepping back just a little bit, when we think about purpose as a concept, where were some of the major citations where this information or the definition was derived? Because with something abstract like purpose, and maybe you can correct me, but with something abstract like purpose, it's not as simple as saying, well, strength is the amount of force you can produce within a specific task. Strength is specific to the skill that's being tested. So, measuring isometric peak force is different from measuring a squat 1RM, which is different from measuring something else. So strength is this within these, constraints. Purpose feels a lot more kind of like smoky and ethereal and harder to pin down. So where were you guys coming up with this concept of what purpose could be or should be kind of standardized as?
I love when you geek out on athleticism. Yeah, keep doing that. This is what attracts people to you. And those that don't, again, it's like almost like a litmus test for who you want to hang out with, like really hang out with. If what you just said and they have like listen, why do you have to always do that? It's like, you know what?
Right.
We can hang out in the gym, but I don't want you at my fire pit. Like we're never going to be like close friends. It's great. I love it. Well, two of my, I mean, I mentioned a few of them. Two of my favorite people who have written books is Vic Straker. And he actually created a self-improvement book, if you don't treat that as if it's like a negative thing, and a graphic comic book about the nature of purpose in life. So Strecher. He's at University of Michigan in their public policy program. And he has some of the best thoughts on purpose. Carol Riff at University of Wisconsin. She's one of the first people to create the first really strong assessment approach to purpose in life. But you're going to see in this paper we're writing, we do actually show that it's actually not a good assessment approach, but major props, nothing but love for she got us on the board in science in terms of like actually trying to operationalize and measure this thing. And you always want to honor your descendants and not use the present to attack the past. And then there's William Damon at Stanford. He's the one that we're having kind of, a friendly, productive conflict where he believes self-transcendence is a fundamental feature of purpose, where we believe it's actually something that alters the influence of purpose. And that's not an academic question. It's actually, I think, a very, very important distinction. And he's written some great books and he's a great thinker. And The reason that I disagree with him is not because I dislike him. It's because he makes me think. And God, I mean, what else can you ask for as someone who's writing books and creating good science? And then I'm biased because he's a close friend of mine, but Anthony Burrow at Cornell University, I just think he's like the best purpose researcher that's alive right now in terms of the coolest studies. He has one, I can't go into too much detail, but it's basically shows that if you prime people to write and think about what their purpose in life before they go on to a train, they are more inclined to sit next to and be comfortable sitting next to someone that is racially different from them. And what a cool freaking study that is. I mean, that's just the idea of these two unrelated areas. Like if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. Before you walk into a situation, I ask you, Josh and Tom, before we go to a party, hey, like, let's like just have a conversation, 5-minute conversation about our purposes in life, about what they are. And then we walk in and you become more open-minded because you don't feel like your sense of self is on the line for a conversation. So someone says, isn't weightlifting just like your friend asking you to move every single day of your life, like pick up boxes, move it from the basement to the attic? I mean, how stupid of a way to spend time is weightlifting. And you won't get as defensive, I would hypothesize, if you thought about your purpose in life before, because you understand the stable architecture of what makes your life worthwhile, and you can laugh in the face of someone that challenges you, and you can agree with them and say, it's a good point, I don't agree with it, but your ego doesn't get stuck in that. And that concept, like, I will never habituate to the awesomeness of that concept.
Well, I really like that because, as someone who recently started going into a weight room with, 10, 15, 20, 30 kids from this high school who are playing football and taking them through, a strength and conditioning workout to prepare them for sport, you can go into it with like, oh, these are the things that matter. Um, Here, this is exactly what the kids should do and how they should execute. And you kind of lose a sense of the individual within the team. And I think priming this concept of purpose beforehand can allow you to see the individual in the team and then see the team as a group versus like, kind of losing that sense of identity and just seeing kids as like, oh, this kid just kind of fucks off a lot and doesn't really work hard. And, you can kind of get past that a little bit. So that concept of thinking about purpose and then going onto a train and having like this less friction with sitting next to people who are racially different, that's really important. And thinking back on that, I feel like conversations I've had about purpose and what we're ultimately trying to do in life has kind of opened me up to people who are different and kind of remove the blinders a bit more. So I think that might be an important practice for me to take forward and maybe for people listening to take forward as well.
Well, and
Yeah,
it's
I mean, yeah. Oh no, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I was just going to add. So, Todd, my background's in kind of business and startup environments, and one of the things that they talk a lot about there is, commonality of mission and vision and culture. And I really see that, the companies that do really, really well are full of people pointed in the same direction who feel like they have the same sense of purpose for being there. So, there's the individual sense of purpose, but then there's also the group or the team coming together around the same thought and the same purpose for being there and achieving similar goals, which I think is also really, really powerful.
I'm so glad you went there. You just set up an alley oop. It's exactly where I was going to go. Is saying, um, just to move into controversial terrain. So when you think about the movement towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and how controversial and politically charged this has become, you have right here from this science a really low cost intervention, which is, before we dive into this, let's think about exactly what, Tom, what you're saying, which is, what is what is the reason that you personally want to be part of this company, besides finances, and why you are dedicating so much of your time and energy? And then similarly, like, why are you interested or not interested in DEI before you have the conversation? Because one of the big problems in this area here, which is where I'm doing a lot of organizational consulting, is people don't think too heavily about, well, what's the reason you're interested in this in the first place? Because you can say it's an end in itself, but it's a little bit of a disingenuous comment. It's more like, if this worked exactly as planned, if we entered in DEI initiatives, what would you expect the organization to be like? How would it be different? And if you just say, well, it it doesn't, it'll be the same, but we'll have like more diverse bodies and more diverse perspectives, that doesn't cut it. Like, you haven't done deep thought about that. And so you should be asking yourself, like, why can't we do that if we just got a bunch of people that are actually really differ in their personality and life history, and have, they none of it is visible for seeing it that way. Like, why do the visible things matter? And then, as opposed to being a contentious question, it becomes more of an exploratory opportunity if you are primed to think about, what is the fundamental objectives of the organization, and why do we think this would be linked to those objectives? And we just skipped over that, and we just shove it in. And that's why I think a lot of this stuff isn't working.
Well, and I think a lot of people look at DE&I and they think race, gender, sexual orientation, diversity, and a lot of the times they don't think about diversity of thought and background. So I'd imagine that the answer to that question, what could this place look like if we implemented this, varies dramatically based on how you define DE&I as an individual and group.
Yeah, and so you want that information. You want that information from the individuals in the team ahead of time, and even better, based on the science of group dynamics, you want it to be independent of the person that had that idea. So you can talk about the ideas that are in that group without knowing who shared that idea yet. This way, you're not automatically listening to the most socially attractive, popular, eminent person in the room,
Right.
the Stephen Hayes in the room. You are treating the newcomer, the intern, the CFO, and the CTO exactly the same, because you have no idea what each one of them said. And what do we typically do in most organizations? It is all hands on deck, publicly, show of hands, say your piece in front of everyone else, and thus we have mixed in popularity and likability with the quality ideas and quality of decision making, and that is a recipe for a suboptimal organization.
Yeah, and we've talked extensively about purpose, and I think it's been a great primer and a really good intro for the paper that you've worked on that will be released hopefully soon. So I'm really excited to dig into that, and then transitioning to meaning. How would you define meaning, and how does that fit into this concept of or the concepts of purpose and meaning?
Yeah, so you have two research teams that have done a good job of capturing the umbrella of meaning. So you have my collaborator, Mike Steger at Colorado State. You have Crystal Park at University of Connecticut, separate teams. And they basically have three different parts to meaning in life. So one, they talk about significance. One, they talk about comprehension. And then one, they talk about its purpose. So we already talked about purpose. The significance part is trying to uncover what it is that brings value to you, to the group that you care about, to the groups that you want to be part of. If you're talking about a country level, to your society. So if you went to New York City for the first time and you were going to a car show at the Jacob Javits Center, you would want to basically try to figure out, like, who's this person, Jacob Javits? Like, why was the center named after them in the first place? And part of meaning is actually trying to find the significance of things that are around you, and you're trying to understand them. And then there's a comprehension element where you're trying to make sense of yourself, other people in the world. And so in this way, you can have little M's and big M's. And the little M's is just, if your kid comes home from school and ends up that they have a bloody nose, comprehension is trying to figure out what happened, as opposed to immediately jumping into problem solving mode. That's like a little M that goes in there. And then on the bigger M for comprehension is to figure out, okay, we basically have a society where it's estimated around 2051 that the racial minorities will become the majority. And so trying to comprehend that trajectory and what could possibly happen, and think about mentally simulating the future and preparing for it now like a chessboard, is a really useful, meaning in life endeavor. And it's very different than purpose in life. And it's very different from significance. It's really trying to understand things. And I think many of us have great strains and difficulties in everyday life, just paying the bills and taking care of little schmoogies and making sure that we're healthy, that we often don't have time for this meaning in life stuff. But what we know is that this is really important in terms of every moment you give away is a piece of the big pie of human existence that you're ignoring for the mundane have tos and want tos. And some of us don't have the opportunity because we're not financially secure. At the same time, what I normally like to say is, do not make the presumption that people that are impoverished or in low socioeconomic situations, that they don't make time for meaning in life. Sometimes they have the most profound, meaningful relationships because they don't have an opportunity to focus on car payments and whether someone piled on them on Twitter. They're focusing on like life itself, and so they actually often have more profound moments of meaning, just not as frequent and intense.
Yeah, thinking about these two as things that are relevant and um, additive when you understand them and can kind of incorporate them into your life, in the sense of, like, I know what it is and this is how I'm working to develop more of it or have more of it or understand its role in my life and what I do. What are some suggestions and recommendations for people thinking about purpose and meaning, how they can start to craft their life to develop more of it, have more of it, or just have a sense of its existence? And I guess, a way to kind of explain how I conceptualize this is Stephen Hayes, I listened to a ton of podcasts he did, and he mentioned, having panic attacks was one of the things that led him to kind of pursuing the work he did, or developing the work he did to the extent that he was able to or is able to. And it was like this profound instance of, here's this thing I struggle with and wrestle with that's forced me to acknowledge thoughts, feelings, sensations, without that kind of like that powerful moment that allows you to transition into, oh, this is what purpose is and this is how I develop it. This is what meaning is and how I create more of it within my life. How can people artificially create that instance so that they can start to engage in it and develop more of it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the simplest tools that's been going on since the 1980s from James Pennebaker at University of Texas at Austin is expressive writing. And so, one thing that I do that's my meaning making system is, for the past, for as long as my twins are now 16. So for as long as they've been alive, I've kept a journal, the Extraordinary Moments Journal, every single day. And it's at least 3. And those can be really aversive experiences or really incredible experiences, because it's just profundity. That's as opposed to a gratitude journal, which would be horrendous to write for 10 years because you'd be repeating the same things over and over and you would get no well-being benefits. But I can go through the past couple weeks of what appears in that journal, and I find trends and I find, regular themes that appear, and that suggests of, oh, you're going down the right path. Like, oh, this is interesting. Like, let's explore like why conversations with strangers keep on appearing, like, with baristas and doormen and doorwomen and ice cream men. Why do those conversations keep on showing up in there? There's something in there about these seemingly superficial interactions that are bringing profound levels of like excitement and intrigue that's in there. And then you can start to learn more about yourself if you're tracking what's happening close to real time, and then doing these nostalgic expeditions about what appears over longer courses of time.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I find myself doing that. I think formalizing a process could be more beneficial, but I find myself going there kind of intellectually somewhat frequently. And it's interesting hearing you talk, because I find a lot of similarities with just like having this interest in relationships and developing them. And as simple as, like, yeah, the barista at Stoff's down the road, talking with her and then realizing she's a power lifter and then saying like, hey, maybe we could work together and we could get you strong and you can compete with, Danny, who I coach, and these other women as well, that appear seemingly out of nowhere because what was just a kind of superficial interaction turned into a conversation and a relationship. And I find that happening, very often. So maybe Todd, you can kind of do some self exploration. Like, why do you think those things carry so much meaning for you?
I mean, to me, as people have these abstract terms, flourishing, happiness, the good life, when it comes down to it, the building blocks are just moments, and we fritter them away regularly. And I think the beauty of capturing, as you're saying, in a non-formal way, just talking about them to other people, thinking about them. I've spent over a decade writing them down. In this way, I'm trying not to fritter away moments, especially like as I get older. Like I'm in my 40s now, so I am aware of the passage of time and how many years are left. I start to think about that, and I wish that I thought more about this when I was younger. I think I was, a lot of us were like impulsive risk takers, especially like boys when we were in our teen years, our 20 years. So I think I had great moments, but I wish I balanced them with trying to cultivate like very intimate, strong friendships. They happened accidentally, but I wish I was more intentional. And so, for anyone listening, in terms of just unsolicited mentoring, it's allow this discernment and intentionality so that you can do therapy without therapists, and you can design your life in all sorts of amazing ways that can be unlike other people. But the way to do that is find, as you've mentioned earlier, like find people that you actually, put on a pedestal in terms of you like their life, and then make sure to figure out what it is about them you like, and then mix that element, getting back to creativity, mix that element with what's showing up regularly in terms of what are the moments where you feel like you're in flow? What are the moments where you feel exuberance? And then what are the moments that you're so upset with indignation and despair and disappointment, because that tells you about what matters to you. And you put those things together and you start to realize like, okay, I need to weight what I do, weight what I do differently, because this appears to be more important and showing up more than what I'm focusing more of my time on.
Yeah, and I find what these podcasts end up becoming are periods of thinking forward and thinking about concepts and trying to understand more and think about their application and learning new information or information we haven't known, acquiring it and then applying it. What I find podcasts also become is thinking about things we've done, conversations we've had, experiences we've had, and reflecting back on them and connecting them to kind of what we're discussing. And Tom's on here with us. He was actually on episode 1. This is episode 202. We kind of started the podcast together, and I bring him on for really special episodes like this. And our friendships developed over the last, I don't know, 6-7 years, to where I would call Tom my best friend, and it was kind of happenstance how we met, and then kind of just being close to each other for that amount of time that's allowed the relationship to develop, the friendship to develop to the extent that it has. And we're very similar and have a lot of similar interests and like to think about complex topics and discuss them regularly, and require a lot of intellectual stimulation to feel like we're engaged and doing something productive. So I find that tends to be, for me, more natural. Like I find things, doing the podcast, as long as I have, this is something that I really get into a flow with and love to do. And then lifting and writing and on all these things, programming for people, writing workouts. So I think everything you're saying, I just think about how my life is compatible with that or has been shaped in that way. And I think it's really insightful, and I hope people are listening kind of think about where their life is at, and if it's moving in that direction, if they want it to, and if it's not, like how can you allow it to, or craft it more so it can.
Yeah, no, I mean, kudos to you for kind of, your life has culminated now to be all the things that kind of has so many elements of things that bring you flow, exuberance, like excitement, curiosity, wonder, awe, all those elements. And I would say when I think about the mental health epidemic, and we're almost at a point where it will be statistically abnormal not to have a psychological disorder at some point as opposed to having one. I mean, we're
Wow.
really like a few percentage points away from this. Is I think that purposelessness, as you mentioned earlier, is one of these very key not the only variable. You can live an amazing life without a purpose in life. um, but this is to me, I like to think of it as the stable architectural framework where you put your life around that. And so as the storm occurs, as the adversity occurs, as you have, um, your crucible moments, it is a purpose that will actually, it will last and allow you to last like through the tunnel of the difficulties, and not other elements of well-being give you that. Maybe relationships do, but few other ones do. Flow and engagement and aspirations and aspirational achievements, they're not going to help you weather the storm the same way as a purpose and a really healthy relationship will.
For fear of digging maybe too deep or going in the wrong direction, you said that you think you can still live an amazing life without purpose or meaning. Based on what you just said, I would almost want to argue against that. It sounds like without a sense of purpose, without a sense of meaning, there'd be some subjective, experience of at least confusion in your life about why you're doing what you're doing, maybe some cognitive dissonance associated there. Can you dig just a little bit more into that? What without purpose and meaning in life might give you, and I think you maybe mentioned relationships, but what would give you that kind of ability to make it through life in an enjoyable or a way that allowed you to realize well-being?
I'm so glad you picked up on that, Tom, because it is a controversial statement. So let me go even more controversial. Let me give a couple of places where people may have a very difficult time having purpose in life. Traumatic brain injuries,
Mm,
very low intellectual functioning. We're talking about IQs lower than 70. Um, so intellectual dysfunctions, and you're talking about people that have something like really significant combat related, sexual assault related, post traumatic stress disorder. In these scenarios, and you're kind of like you have this fight or flight response occurring on a regular basis, it's really hard to develop like a sense of purpose in life. And there are plenty elements of well-being that you can attain without and being present moment focused. So you're talking about love, you're talking about creativity, you're talking about flow states, you're talking about, as you mentioned, positive relationships, you're talking about you can still satisfy all of your primary psychological needs of being a human. The need to feel a sense of belonging, you were seen, you were cared for and understood, your need for mastery, where you can actually accomplish things and work on things where you are skilled, develop skills and strengths without purpose in life. People can be trained by you guys, and other people, and kind of develop a real mastery in sports, and have a bodily awareness and bodily appreciation. And you can develop your sense of autonomy. I feel as if you have freedom to walk through the world. You can make your own choices and decisions and be independent of your primary caregivers and society and culture. And if you identify with strong with the political party, guess what? You can disagree with them, and that party doesn't care because they don't care about you. And so you can have all of these elements without a purpose in life. I just believe that with a purpose, um, the potentiality to have stronger, lasting well-being elements enhances greatly.
mm. Yeah. Does it? It sounds like it almost acts as well, like as a buffer potentially against some of these other things where maybe you don't have, maybe in the moment you don't feel a certain way, you don't feel that love from a relationship, or you don't feel like you're making progress in this skill that you're trying to master, but you can lean back on your purpose, know that in the future you're going to have those opportunities to experience those things. Does that sound right?
Oh yeah. Oh no no. Yeah. I mean, listen. I'm ready to like put a tattoo of the benefits of purpose in life on my calf. I mean, I'm not here to attack purpose in life. I do want to say is, unlike a lot of other psychological models, you could acquire well-being without it. It's just, this is
For sure.
what a great, efficient, effective path if you have it. And at least there's all sorts of other questions that will linger for listeners, right? How many purposes can you have before it's actually too many to handle and actually leads to disruptions to well-being? And then what I was opening up the door to is, who does not have the psychology that allows them to have a purpose, biologically and psychologically. That's a controversial issue, but we should be asking questions that are not necessarily like designed to be Miss Universe questions where everyone gets everything. Well, no, it's just not how humans operate. We can't have every skill, strength, and possibility. And I think there is an overcorrection to assume that everything is possible for everyone. And I often tell my students in my college classes, if you look at the universities that past presidents have been in, none of you are going to be Secretary of State, Vice President, or President. Like, not even close. You're going to George Mason, and no offense, it's just public school in Virginia that happens there, and that's okay. And so we have a conversation about, like, just me saying that, like, what does that do for you? And you find a whole range of reactions. Some people are pissed. Some people complain to administrators, and other people are like, huh, like, let me think about that. And then they go research it, and they see how many like presidents went to Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Brown. And that, it takes a long while before you get to college anywhere near. The closest you get is like University of Michigan. I think Eisenhower went there. And it's just interesting. It's a fun conversation to have, of knowing that not everything is possible. We always say, like, you have this like colloquial phrase, like, as a kid, you could be anything you want. And it's no, because you're not a tabula rasa. You have a particular genome and you have a particular temperament. And yeah, you could change it, but there's a question of, like, how much can you really change? Is it 15%? It's definitely not 80%.
The idea that, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say shout out to Steven Pinker for The Blank Slate. If anything that Todd just mentioned kind of resonated with you, I would check out that book. It's incredible, and I love the conversation about kind of the concept of being a blank slate versus being entirely pre-programmed. So I think that's a great resource, and I think what I kind of heard when you talk about you can be void of purpose and still live a meaningful life, or still live a life that's worth living, is very, very reliant on the social structure and the social support you have in place and the people around you. And I think that's why it's kind of critical for the development of great relationships. And in those specific situations, you are less able maybe to choose who you can develop relationships with, but it's this inherent reliance on just the people close, and that they're they're able to supply you with all of that. And I've been lucky to have people who I'm really close with who are able to supply that, and I feel like that's out there for everyone if you just kind of can strike up those conversations and start to explore it, and become interested in people, and develop some sort of like working relationship and see where it gets to. You can develop relationships with friends and significant others who ultimately will provide a lot of what could potentially be missing without an overarching purpose.
Yeah, I love what you just said there, Josh. And Tom, I love your provocative questions as someone who loves provocations.
I
Yeah,
did
and
want to.
Todd, I just want to say, I mean, it's been an absolute privilege to have you on the. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
No. If you wanna go ahead, Josh, that's totally cool.
No, jump in.
All right. So back to the provocative question, Todd. You did say, not everything is possible, and I definitely agree with that. Doesn't provoke me at all. But do you think that statement and this idea that we want things to be available to everybody, does that negatively impact the development of potential interventions for folks who might be experiencing, suboptimal well-being, or maybe even anxiety and depression? Does it lean people to develop interventions that are intended to be kind of these panaceas for a huge population of people versus really trying to target this individual's needs?
Yeah, it's a really so it's a great question, and we're moving to personalized medicine. I don't know if the two of you have been exposed to actually having a functional medicine visit where actually they actually figure out like which enzymes and nutrients are your body is actually responding to negatively. Even maybe if 10 years ago you didn't have any gaseous reaction to these foods, and all of a sudden it kind of changed over time. Like it's like an amazing thing to see of no matter what the science says about the benefits of egg whites or not, your body individually is not responding to that. And I think we are moving to this finally. Thankfully, this gets to what I said earlier about scientifically informed guidance versus evidence-based guidance, is to be informed by the science, but to figure out individually what works for you. And so thankfully the field is going that direction. And I do believe that consumers of this, multi-billion dollar self-help, self-improvement market really have to make sure to read these books from a slight distance, such that of not treating it as if it's like biblical in nature, but more of like, okay, I'm gonna like choose some of these things that work, and I'm going to experiment with them, and I'm going to add add a little jalapeno here and add some oregano here, and play with these ideas. And I definitely don't want, on the other end, anyone to hear that and say, well, because not everything's possible for me, I'm going to have a sense of hopelessness. I would say is and I mean, this is why the two of you do what you do. We don't know what our potential is, but what we do know, at least intuitively, is that we are all given a talent stack and a strength profile that we lean towards, and we could use some guidance of how to maximize the possibilities with the genetic and the psychological profiles that we have developed and been given over the course of our lifetime. And so, how we do that, um, everyone's got to kind of figure out for themselves, but you can't figure out until you start treating the world like a mad scientist and start experimenting.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's one that's been backed up in my personal experience programming and training people to become better powerlifters or weightlifters, is you have to create something that's individualized to them, in the sense of, we know what the main drivers of progress are. We know that volume of training, in the sense of like muscular contractions over time in a day, week, or month, will lead to more or less muscle growth, because stretch under load, and then the contraction is a strong signal, or creates a strong signal for muscle growth, in the presence of, depending on the trainedness of the person, enough food and enough protein. And I know that, like, well, that volume needs to the volume needs to be manipulated based on the person, so that it's a strong enough response or stimulus. And then with getting stronger, the intensity or the load, the weight on the bar, the percentage of their 1 rep max with the exercise, also contributes to becoming better at 1RMs and developing more force production, and allowing to move more weight. And when you put together enough training programs, you realize no one can use the exact same thing and get the same results. It has to be individualized. So I think it really creates a strong sense of N equals one. And having done that long enough, it's like everyone needs something very specific to their situation, not just from training or nutrition, but entirely. With every single concept we can talk about and discuss, it's got to be specific to the person, because the person, the farther along they are in their life, the more complex it is, the more it's situationally dependent, experientially dependent, and the less able we are to just overlay these kind of like these taglines of like, do more, eat less. It's like, well, that's relevant. It really loses the nuance. There's your word, Todd, for the individual.
uh, I can listen to you all day. I mean, this is just gold. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and Tom, hopefully you're kind of wrapped up, because I just wanted to kind of end it here, and I think it'd be a great way to transition at some point into another episode, or Todd, if you end up going on Tom's podcast, if that's a connection that's made. But I'm incredibly privileged, honored. Again, your work's been hugely impactful for me, and it's something that I absolutely love reading and seeing, and I get really excited anytime I see something's written or released from you, whether that's on Instagram, an email, a book, an article. for people who are listening and they said they would say, this is my first time listening to Todd on a podcast, where would you direct them in the sense of like, read this book, read this article, listen to this thing, and you'll get a good sense of my work, and you'll get a good sense of kind of everything else that you can kind of follow from that point on?
Well, first of all, thank you for all the kind words. And I mean, honestly, I love talking to you guys. I don't even look at the clock when I'm hanging with you guys. Um, I mean, really, everything you can get is from my website, toddkashdan.com. And I would suggest that everyone subscribe for free to my Substack, because I'm just sharing whatever ideas I'm just kind of just sort of merging, developing in my head. And it's the original points of all the new books I'm going to be writing are going to come from these loose thoughts that I'm kind of merging together. And the thing that, I mean, I give away my science. There's 220 plus scientific articles on my website, and they're all free. So just go on toddkashdan.com, download them, contact me. I'll send them all to you. I mean, I am a big believer of, you don't necessarily need to pay $50,000 a year to go to college. It can be supplemented by just really reading comprehensive, detailed information that's out there. And I really try to curate stuff that other people aren't saying, because I'm not trying to be the person for any one thing. And there's a lot of great people that have their one thing. I like to kind of synthesize the whole holistic nature of humans.
And I think that's captured really well in the sense of the first podcast we did together. I think we looked at your paper on, I think it was a paper on psychological flexibility. And then this one, I went into it completely blind, and I just threw meaning and purpose up in the link. And it's like, hey, let's see where it goes. And I think the fact we can do that kind of speaks to your completeness or your well-roundedness with just so many different topics and ideas. So yeah, I'll drop all that stuff down below. Tom, if people are interested in checking out either your podcast, what you do, your lifting, all of your kind of tactical work, and all that stuff, where can they find it?
Yeah, Purpose and Meaning Podcast on Instagram. That's where I'm going to be posting all my podcasts. Post a little bit of personal content on there as well, but that's my public account at the moment.
Awesome. Yeah, and if anyone's interested in keeping up to speed with me, and you don't already because Todd drove you here, I'm on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PHILWL. I have a website. It's philosophicalweightlifting.com. I write for Team Meta and weightlifting.ai. Every link you can imagine you'd want to click on will be down below. So explore the description, and give yourself about 2 hours to kind of go through it all, because there's going to be a lot there. Thanks again for listening to another episode of the podcast, and we will catch you guys next week.